So hi, I'm John.
And I'm Jo.
Welcome to our podcast, Extraordinariness,
where we explore the motivations behind ordinary people's extraordinary accomplishments. So John, who are we hearing from this week?
Well, this week we're hearing from a really interesting guy called Rob Casserley. Now, this was actually one of your picks for interviews. And I
found him. I remember finding him in the research.
And I don't remember what happened, but I just remember me ended up doing the interview and I was working and I was late, and I'm not going to lie, I hadn't done as much preparation as I'd done for the other interviews. So when I actually sat down with Rob to find out what he'd done, he actually surprised me with a few things that I hadn't realised.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, so we talked about the fact that basically he's a mountaineer and he's summited Everest, I think 8 times at the time, and he was also the first Westerner to make a double summit, so 2 summits within a week. What I hadn't realised is that he'd also rowed nearly all of the Atlantic Ocean. And
of course he has.
Yeah, so there was quite a few things that came out. So if I seem like I'm a little bit surprised, it's for that reason.
I've got written down here that you're the first Westerner to twice double summit Everest in 1 week.
Okay, that's probably a truth. Yeah, I believe that's true.
You've been up to the peak of Everest 8 times. Is it 8 times still? And how many of those times were you not guiding?
Just 1. Oh, sorry, 2.
Okay.
2.
Right. 2
for myself and 6 with other people. It's much harder with other people.
It's much. So, I presume the first time you went, you weren't climbing it solo, though.
No. I was on a so-called commercial guiding trip, which was unguided. So I went with who's now a very close friend, Henry Todd, and his expeditions are for people who theoretically have capacity and a kind of an understanding of mountain environments, have probably the the wherewithal to climb the mountain, but it's a Sherpa-led guided trip. Right. And these days, actually, commercial guiding is evolving more and more into Sherpa-led expeditions. But the kind of comfort with Henry is that you had a Western base camp set up, the things that you were familiar with, and his guidance from base camp. And then on the mountain, it was ourselves independently or with Sherpas.
Okay.
A great thing.
So what came first, Everest or your Atlantic rowing attempt?
Everest. Everest is a springboard for a lot of it. Yeah, Everest has opened so many doors for me. When I was in the army in 1995, I was in Kenya with the Royal Engineers.
Yeah,
and we as part of our rest and recuperation periods, one of the trips we did was Mount Kenya, and so it was just a trekking peak. I was vomiting quite a bit. I had diarrhea. It was probably infection more than altitude, but combined with altitude, dehydration, having no knowledge and no guidance from anyone around because we were just a bunch of guys having a go. We only went to, it's 4,900 meters, so it's not extreme, but it is high altitude, 15,000 feet. It's over 15,000 feet.
So before that, you hadn't had, you hadn't had just a desire to climb mountains?
No, none at all. I'm from Kent, a low-lying county. I don't think there's any great alpinists who've come from my neck of the woods.
I was surprised that it wasn't a lifelong desire, a longing to climb to the top of any peak you could see. In fact, this experience of altitude actually had the opposite effect.
So I'd had a bit of climbing background on Mount Kenya and realised that altitude wasn't for me. And then actually, there is a pivotal moment. One of the pivotal moments was teeing up my medical school elective. So I went to Newcastle University after a year in the army. I was a second lieutenant in the army. I did a month at Sandhurst. It was a great kind of man-making experience, I say tentatively these days. So then I went to Newcastle University, and in the 4th year of med school, you have to choose an elective. So you go and travel normally outside of the UK and work in a foreign hospital or I don't know, in the field, wherever you can find a place that will accept you. So I went to Peru. And I kind of went to Peru because I wanted to do most people don't work that hard on their elective. It's more about, broadening your horizons, making you a real person before you become a doctor. And so I'd seen, I read an article in the Sunday Times magazine, and it was by Matthew Paris, who is a political commentator. I'm not sure if he's still doing the same. But he was travel writing as well at the time. This is like the late 1990s. And there's a time when you could phone up the Times, because there was no real internet. There was the internet. It just started becoming more widely used, but it was still not that easy to find out information as easily as we do now. And so I called the Times, and he took a call, and he said, "Hey, if you're in Newcastle, I live in Derbyshire, come down and meet me, and I'll tell you about how I climbed Mount Illimani, which is a mountain he climbed in Bolivia." So I was thinking, well, it's close to Peru. It'd be a way to get into Bolivia. So I spent a great day, or maybe a weekend, with him and his partner, and they were very kind, very welcoming. He gave me a signed book of Inca Kola, one of his books he'd written. It was an amazing opportunity. So then I went to Bolivia and climbed Huayna Potosi. I was due to climb 2 mountains, but I'd rode Lake Titicaca. I'd been traveling. I'd done the Inca Trail, backpacking myself. It was like I had an amazing time up until that mountain. And then I got really bad sore throat. We got to the summit quite easily. Coming down, I was with a guide who made a harness out of rope for me, and another guy that was just on the trip. I forget who he was or how his link was to the trip. But on the way down, it was becoming quite warm and sunny. So from the very summit, which was just a little ridge at the top, I was so disappointed. I was so terrified when I got there. On the way down, we were being belayed down by the guide, and then his ice picket fell out, and we all started sliding down and had to do an ice axe arrest. Now, I don't think we were in any grave danger. In retrospect, it was probably a slope of 30, 40 degrees, and we would have just come sliding down to a gradual halt. But it felt pretty real at the time. Yeah. And I just said, never again, never, never, never again. The next day, I looked back at that mountain from La Paz, the capital of Bolivia, and you can see the mountains all around you. I saw Huayna Potosi, this beautiful kind of pointy mountain, and it was just the most incredible sense of achievement I've ever had, to have put myself through that apparent adversity, physical challenge for no obvious gain at the time. But then afterwards was my first real sense of, post-event. I'm a post-event adrenaline junkie.
I love that sentiment, a post-event adrenaline junkie.
Yeah.
Which is so unusual to so many of the other people we've spoken to.
Yeah.
Who really thrive on the adrenaline in the moment.
Yeah, I love the fact that he's like, never again.
Yeah.
But then a few hours later down the bottom.
It doesn't seem to take much for him to,
No.
You don't have to twist his arm.
No.
Just such a confident person in what I could achieve. And so it really had clicked something in my head about what I was capable of doing. I then plunged into medical school. I plunged into being a junior doctor. It was like at the coal face, 80, 90 hours a week. Like everyone was in it, sleeves rolled up. It was just fantastic. And we were junior doctors. We were house officers. We lived in the house of God. So there I was, living at the hospital. And it was like being a student again, but with a bit of cash and a great deal of responsibility. Not that much, actually, in your first year. You kind of, you're supervised a lot. But nonetheless, it comes, with the time on the job. But I met someone who'd been on Everest, and he didn't make it, but he was on an unguided trip, a bit like the trip that I did the first time in 2003. But he said, yeah, you can climb Everest for £8,000 and not the $40,000 or $50,000 that I'd read about. So suddenly it became financially... Oh, okay, financially that's possible. And then my second flat that I moved into my second house job. So you when you change hospital, you change the place that you live. You live in the hospital that you work at. There was a map of Everest on the wall. And in the preceding year, I'd read Into Thin Air by Jon Krakauer, which is a book about a tragedy on Everest in 1996. And most people would read it and say, that's crazy. 11 people died. I think it was 11, but 11 people died in some sort of awful storm. You'd never do that. It's crazy to do something like that. But I looked at it as, well, think about the other 100 who survived. There was something incredible that they all survived this terrible storm, and only 11 people died. Those three things, I think, kind of focused my mind by the end of my house job. I was thinking about, could I climb Everest? I'd kind of like to do that, but when would I do that? I did a A&E in Bristol, accident and emergency, 2001, summer of 2001, going into the winter of 2001 too. And drug addiction, social deprivation, people self-harming, people mutilating other people, people being drunk and disorderly, urinating, vomiting in an emergency department for 6 months, and you just go at the end of it. I wanted to be a doctor to help people, but most of the time you're playing around with like personality disorders, people who are deliberately harming other people or deliberately harming themselves, and you're just treating social problem after social problem. And it's just like, if there was a time that I could get out of medicine, this may be the time to get out. Go travel the world, become a really great climber, and hopefully at the end of the year, climb Everest. And that's kind of what I did.
What do you have to do what sort of training do you do? So you set out and said, you know what, I've climbed a couple of mountains. What do you have to do to say, right, well, I'm going to climb Everest in a year's time? What's the training look like?
Well, that's the controversial thing. These days you may actually be able to find someone who'd take you on. And, I'll say this honestly, I've taken a friend on Everest who had very little climbing experience, but had lots of other credentials. And because I knew I was going to be giving pretty much round-the-clock surveillance and in so-called care on the mountain, it was acceptable to me to bring them along. But most of the time, clearly you need to be competent with crampons, ice axe, general mountaineering competencies that probably most people have who go for a weekend trip in the Alps.
So when you decided to climb Everest, how did you go about getting all of this competency?
So there was a thing called the Seven Summits, which is still a thing. So the highest mountain in every summit. And I was going to be starting in summer. And so it kicked off by doing, I had a couple of obvious expeditions, Elbrus followed by Denali. And probably on Denali, I thought myself, probably less well experienced than I could have been, but I just climbed Elbrus. This is a straightforward climb in Russia. It's on the Russian-Georgian border. It was me and a friend, and we went with 2 guides. So we were one-to-one with local Russian guides. It was like $700 to climb Mount Elbrus. It was an amazing trip, an incredible trip, 2002. But we summited relatively easily, and there was no question about it wasn't that difficult physically. So I was like, oh, that's reassuring. And I've been up to a mountain of 6,000 meters. So I'd realized now that I was pretty strong on a mountain. Could I do things technically? That was another question. So going to Denali was the next kind of step up. And Denali, or Mount McKinley as other viewers, it's also known. A lot of people had, really outlined that as one of the hardest of the 7 summits that you could do. So it's the highest mountain in North America, in Alaska. So a great location to visit. I was in a team. I turned up feeling a bit worried about how competent I was, but in fact, I was probably one of the more competent people, which makes me, realize that expedition climbing and what commercial guiding and climbing means these days is that, it can be quite variable about what the prerequisites that aren't often pursued, sadly, by these big trip organizers. But we didn't summit Denali, so my 7 summits bid was off already. But we had bad weather. We were stuck at a camp of 14,000 feet for a week. But I learned kind of mountain craft, digging holes, building walls, keeping the stove going all night long, taking snow off the tent when, we had snow overnight for a few days in a row, how to cross crevasses safely. You learn all that kind of craft from the guides, from retrospect. And so I came back a bit disappointed, but then I went to the Andes, went climbing some more technical peaks with, again, I was finding small companies with local guides, one-to-oneing, learning, really going through a great apprenticeship, actually. And then in winter, I went to Aconcagua with Henry. Sorry, I'm missing the big thing out. I'd arranged to go on a trip with a company to Chiaoyu, the 6th highest mountain in the world. I'd read that this was probably one of the prerequisites for Everest summit was an 8,000 meter mountain before. So building up from Russia to Alaska to the Andes, I was working in between trips, by the way. It sounds like I had this kind of
amazing year off.
I was working bloody hard in locum jobs in between, mainly in emergency. I didn't want to walk away from medicine. I just needed a bit of space to experiment with who I was. But Chiaoyu, the 6th highest mountain in the world, the so-called easiest 8,000 meter mountain in the world. And I get asked often, what's the hardest mountain you've climbed, or what's the easiest one? Or any mountain on its day can be deadly and very tricky. And so it's hard to say. Objectively, it's one of certainly the more straightforward routes that you can do. the company that I was supposed to go with, I came back from the Alps, from the Andes, from Peru, and the company had written a letter. It was like before, a little bit before email was being used universally. So I came home to find a letter saying, "I'm sorry, we didn't have enough people for our expedition, so we've put you with Henry Todd to go to Chiroyu. He'll meet you in 2 days' time when you fly. He'll meet you in Kathmandu." It's like, wow, okay. And I'd spent months researching which company I was willing to trust my life to on an 8,000 meter mountain, and suddenly they've pulled the rug out from my feet. Actually, by this time I'd learned, you have to, you have to predict unpredictability. You have to know how to react. React straight away. Don't wait don't and ah it too much. You have to always think of what can be happening or what can go wrong to predict the unpredictable, and then you'll be able to react in a better way. And so I went and had a great time with Henry. We summited Chiroyu. It's a fantastic expedition. He said, "Look, you've signed up with the other company to go to Everest next year, but actually I think you'd be better off served coming with us." And he's like an uncle. He's such a good friend to me now. He's like a mentor. He's an amazing character. Yeah. But yeah, he said, "Come with us on Everest," and I did, and we summited it in the spring of the following year. But a tough summit day, tough conditions, tough everything. But I learned the hard way.
So just talk us through, because I imagine a lot of people probably don't know how climbing a mountain like Everest works. Obviously, it's not something where you kind of put your pack on in the morning and go, right, off we go. So what do you have to do to summit Everest? How does it work?
So so you have to prepare yourself physically. So you're well advised to turn up relatively in good measure physically to take on the task. But because it takes so long to acclimatize, which is an essential for getting to the altitudes that you'll be flying at, because it takes time to acclimatize to the higher parts of the mountain, you've got time to get yourself into physical shape. So a lot of people ask, what do you physically have to do prior to going on a big trip like that to get in shape? And the answer actually is probably up until your mid-40s, and if you're in relatively good shape anyway, not a lot. Again, this is a shocking thing to say that anyone can do Everest, but actually, amazingly, and that's what makes me feel good about it, actually anybody can do Everest in the right circumstances with the right preparation. You have to learn etiquette on the mountain. I think there are things that are done, ways that things are done that take time to adjust to. As a young buck, I was like excited to get going. I wanted to go as quickly as I could. I wanted to be up and down the quickest. Everything was about beating my last effort or beating the person ahead of me. But actually, it's much more internal when you're on a big mountain like this. It's a kind of, you have to conserve energy. You have to realize that getting to the summit is only halfway up. You've got to get back down as well. So it's a big psychological game, actually, if you want to succeed at high altitude. You've got to know that there'll be days when there is nothing doing. You can't go when there's a storm. So you sit there. You sometimes end up doing very, very little. And I think I've not been in a wartime situation. When I was in the army, there was no active combat. But my reading of some expeditions to or excursions to Afghanistan and Iraq, there's obviously times when you're in incredible perilous danger, but you're probably more at danger from boredom when you're just at camp, not doing a lot, or you're doing very arduous chores. And I think,
I was just about to say, it sounds like it could be very boring at times.
Yeah, but if you're that kind of person who needs TV, or before maybe 2007, we didn't have a DVD player at base camp. We didn't have the internet. Yeah. Now it's all like internet, unlimited internet for like $100 a month, and people are like loving it. And it's like the best food, the warmest camp.
And how long do people tend to stay at base camp?
You can be there for 6 to 8 weeks.
Wow. Okay, that's a long time.
Yeah, but you're going up and down the mountain. So in terms of how you do it, acclimatization, you go up to a certain altitude. You may go to Camp 1 and then Camp 2 in one trip and come back down. So that's from 5,400 meters at base camp to 6,000 at Camp 1, 6,400 at Camp 2. Spend a couple of days and nights there. You come back down. You have 3 or 4 days of regenerating, eating, shitting, sleeping. You know, that's pretty much the recipe for success. But excuse my French.
And the purpose of this is for your body to basically more red blood cells, make it so that you can hold more oxygen. This is the purpose of the acclimatization and going up and down.
Exactly. And so you can't do it alpine style.
At this point in the discussion, Rob and I went off on a tangent discussing high altitude supplementary oxygen. But what I wanted to know was the double summit. How did that come around? If people tend to take so long to do one summit of Everest, what was involved in that double summit? And just in case you're interested, I've left the supplementary oxygen discussion on the end of the podcast.
The 2 summits was basically, I was asked in 2007 by Kenton Poole, a much more elite athlete, is a really good friend. He's summited Everest about 15, 16 times from the UK. He's just climbed K2. You know, he's the main man in British climbing, or high altitude British climbing. He said, you know, you've been up Everest twice. You know, there's not many, but in 2007, not many people had summited Everest twice from the UK or at all, Westerners. So he said, you know, would you? I know you're not a guide, but would you come and be a high altitude T-boy? Come and help me look after a group of. He had 4 or 5 people he was looking after. So it's a bit too many for just one guide, and they were paying him proper guide fees to look after him. And so I met them before we went, and they were happy for me to go. They knew that I'd summited twice. Being a doctor, it was always that was a great card to have, actually.
Yeah, definitely.
So I went, and half the team got ill pre-first summit attempt. They got diarrhea, and they just said, we can't go. You know, it's just not the moment. And of course, that's their decision. We thought that was their chance gone. So we went up on the first attempt with the ones who were well. We summited on the 17th of May. Came down. We got down to the South Col, stayed the night, and came down from the South Col all the way to base camp on the 18th. So normally you'd take 2 days to come down. We came down in a oneer. It was quite impressive, actually. It was like a long day. Yeah. And then the guys who were ill prior to leaving, we'd left maybe 5 days earlier, were much better. And they said, look, you know, we still want to go. So I hadn't thought much about it. I was of the feeling, you miss your chance. It's done and dusted. I didn't know that there would be another opportunity, but they had an amazing weather window in 2007. Another window opened up. Kenton said, what do you think? Do you want to go a second time? I was like, bloody hell. Of course, this is a chance to do a first. This was from a kind of a very embarrassingly egoistic kind of sense, this was a great challenge for me. It wasn't just about getting other people up to the summit safely, but also it was about, so it was about putting something drawing a line in the sand around a new record. It was about doing something good for them. They'd spent $30,000-$40,000. It wasn't coming to me that money, but that's what the sort of number they paid. And so that's, we should do our best to give them a chance. So we went up a second time. Kenton was ill. He had diarrhea all the way. He kind of went up, but we didn't see much of him at that time for understandable reasons. And I was in the slow lane with these guys who did make it to the summit, safe and sound. We came down and we lived to tell the tale.
So another interesting thing is that this wasn't an intentional record. It wasn't something he set out to do. It was kind of seizing an opportunity that presented itself. Yeah, basically. And I think it's probably best not to underestimate the physical feat as well, because I think being up at high altitude for a long time has big effects on your body. There's pulmonary edema and all sorts of things that the altitude affects you in a big way. So being able to, I think just the physical effort of going up and down. Yeah, it's no mean feat.
Yeah.
I do love how he is very honest, that he does accept that he's doing something good and he wants to help the other people, but there is still a modesty in his acceptance of the fact that he knew he was achieving something for himself as well. Yeah. And I do like that honesty.
Yeah.
Because I got I diagnosed it now as tracheitis, and I've become probably, although I haven't written about it in medical journals, I'm probably the world's expert on high altitude tracheitis.
What's tracheitis?
So your trachea is your main airway leading to the bronchi in each lung, which divide multiple times to go into the lobes of your lungs. So it's the major conduit or conduit for passing oxygen from the atmosphere via your mouth to your lungs. And basically, cold air inflames cold and dry air, and probably hypoxic air is not good for the lining of your trachea, so it becomes inflamed. So you get a cough, a bit like with bronchitis, seasonal cough. But I realized I was getting stridor. So when you breathe in, so the tube was getting narrower and narrower. And I was coughing and coughing, and I had a kind of unusual voice. And I remember coming on the way down, I sat at the balcony having a coughing fit. And then suddenly this tube came flying out of my mouth. And then I breathed back in, and it went back in, and I was like blocking my airway. So I had to literally jump up and down. Being a medic, I kind of had the presence of mind to think about it and dislodge this kind of tube out of my upper airway. And I remember just like playing with it. And it was literally 10 centimeters long.
Yeah.
It was a cast of my trachea. I was like, geez, I felt a whole lot better once I got that up, but I felt pretty rough, as you can imagine. But it was a kind of a mechanical blockage to my airway. It was like, crikey. I talk about that only to say that in 2010, someone had a respiratory arrest from the same thing in retrospect. I'm quite clear about that in my mind now. At Camp 2 after summiting. Her name's Anita, and she's gone on to have 2 children and lives in the States now. But she'd summited, and it's probably my only time on the mountain where I can say I've really saved somebody's life.
I don't understand. So
I didn't understand when he first told me this. My understanding of it is that the air caused like an inflammation on the airway, and then he coughs that inflammation out. It's kind of like a
so it's not
cast.
Like a physical part of his body.
No, it's like a cast of his trachea from all of the inflammation and stuff.
And like the mucus,
yeah.
Okay,
basically.
so it's not a part of his sort of internal organ.
No, it's not like he's coughed up his entire trachea, but it's as he says, it's a cast of his trachea. But nevertheless, that would freak me out. I mean, because I would have felt like I coughed up.
Listening to this, I'm not going to lie, and if that happened to me, I would never. I don't think I could go up the stairs.
You have to deal with the situation in hand. But it turns out, like if you run more oxygen through your airway at high flows of oxygen, it's the oxygen is desiccated. There's no humidity within. So in some ways, it makes it even worse, I think. It's a kind of you're a self-precipitating cycle. But in 2007, I didn't think much more of it. In 2010, I'm coming down with Bonita. Imagine the comms issues with Bonita, a young friend who's fallen at the Hillary Step and has got back pain and can't descend, down with Anita. So Anita starts having breathing difficulties whilst Bonita is being transferred down. And all of this energy is going into saving Bonita. The radio is constantly being used to talk about Bonita. Anita says to me at Camp 3, we've been to the summit from the South Col at 8,000 meters, up to the summit, back down to the South Col. And we decided to get down to Camp 2. It's much safer at Camp 2. It's a huge day for anybody. But I thought they had it in them, and it was probably on balance the best thing to do. We get to Camp 3 and she says, Rob, I can't breathe. I'm having trouble breathing. I said, well, I didn't have a stethoscope on, I'm a doctor, but I put my hands on her back. There was no kind of feeling of a pneumonia, which you can feel by what's called tactile vocal fremitus. When they speak, you transmit more easily with pus in the lungs or pneumonia. I said, no, I can't hear any wheeze. I think you'll be fine. And I just gave her an inhaler. Just, I had, for one reason or another, I had an inhaler in my pocket. Things like, emergency first aid. Yeah. Take that, we'll be fine. I come down and she's getting slower and slower. And we eventually get into Camp 2, like in the dead of night, maybe 7, 8 in the evening. It's that point, when we get to the base of the Lhotse face, no one's there to help us, no lights. We're still a good hour and a half from getting to Camp 2 and their relative safety. Everyone's still talking about Bonita, who's a dear friend. So I'm in distraught about Bonita, wanting to make sure she gets down to the South Col. And I have to say, break. This is Robert. Space of the Lotsie face. We're all alone. We have a problem. We have a medical problem with Anita, like a serious medical problem. Someone bring up oxygen rapidly.
So they realise that no one's going to be able to get oxygen to them, and they manage to push on down to Camp 2 with Anita, and basically
all the while Bonita is
everyone's worrying about Bonita,
yeah.
And so that, I think that might be one of the reasons why no one's able to come and help Rob with Anita. So they get down to Camp 2, and he basically like, right, well, look, we're here, you need to go rest.
So I'm just about to fall asleep because I was knackered, as you can imagine, and her husband drags me out of my tent. She's gone blue, she's not breathing. And as I get to the mess tent, she comes running out. I can't breathe. And then she falls to the ground, and that's it. She's dead.
Oh my gosh.
She's not breathing, she's nothing. And so I didn't, you're supposed to feel for a pulse, but I'm pretty sure I didn't. I think I just started doing compressions. And as I did chest compressions, a lot of stuff came out of her airway, like a lot of nasty material came out of her airway. And so she had seesawing of her abdomen. Normally when you breathe in, your abdomen shouldn't like go, it's a kind of a paradoxical movement of abdomen blowing out when it should be sucking in for inspiration, expiration. So she had that for sure. But like I gave her dexamethasone into her jugular vein. I basically said, I can't deal with this. I'm like, I don't know how to think properly. I was like on the radio, cut all radio chatter. This is Rob, Camp 2. We have a respiratory arrest. I had friends who were doctors at base camp. They just said, right, do this. And I was just like a tool, a tool being controlled by my friends at base camp.
Yeah.
So I just did what they told me to do, and she survived. But in retrospect, she had tracheitis as well.
Right.
So it's an underdiagnosed reason for sudden death at high altitude, I'm quite sure. An airway obstruction due to inflammation of the trachea. We have travelled, we have like digressed from probably the reasons why we should be talking, but it's a fascinating subject, high altitude physiology, what can go wrong physically. But at the end of the day, most of the problems that we encounter are psychological. You need to be really rip-roaringly strong to up here. That's what it takes to climb Everest.
So one thing usually we're talking to someone we're talking about one particular adventure. So say we're talking about Marathon des Sables or transcontinental bike race or something like that. So we usually ask, what's the highest point and the lowest point? So for you, I guess, across your Everest summits, and I haven't even talked about the rowing thing. I'm going to try and get 2 minutes of that in a minute. Right. So across all of your Everests, time on Everest, time climbing Everest, or just time climbing mountains in general, what's kind of the highest point you've had, and perhaps what's the lowest point that you've had?
Wow. There's been a lot of highs and a lot of lows. I mean, certainly I've lost great friends in the mountains. I've been on trips where they've died during the expedition. So 2005 was one of the years where we didn't summit, and Rob Milne, a teammate on the trip, I met him there. We weren't close friends before. I don't think we were particularly close during the expedition, but as with all of these things, when you spend a lot of time with someone, you see the best and the worst, but you're there for a combined reason of, you're all sharing the same goal. So, by default, we were close. And losing him on Summit Day in 2005 made me realize the mountains were, it wasn't just a playground. It wasn't just for fun. Yeah. And when you do climb something like Everest, you really need to want to do it, because you could lose your life. It's not probable, but it's not unlikely either. So that was that. I've lost Tundu. Tundu's one of my closest friends, Sherpa friends, who died on Amadablam in 2016. We'd just been on Shoyu with him. My wife and I, we summited Shoyu with him, and Dan, a good friend of Dan. To Tundu, I went to the Khumbu on a trekking trip with him afterwards, and we were talking about what number did it need for him to get out of high altitude climbing? What number did I need to bring in from trekking trips to pay him on an annual basis to make him perhaps stop doing high altitude mountains just because he had to, from a financial basis, or he felt that he had to? And we were just talking about that kind of subject as I left him, and he said, I think I'm going to do Amadablam this year, just a kind of final supplement. I'd be safe. And he died that season. And he was hit by there was a small earthquake which triggered a serac fall, and a block of ice hit him on his head. And it's it's by hook or by crook. It's those sliding doors moments. Had he been 5 minutes higher or 5 minutes lower, he would have been one of those innocuous moments in time. And then the big serac fall in 2014, the earthquake in 2015. We lost 3 teammates at base camp from the earthquake in 2015, which wiped out half of the camp. There's some awful tragedies. I can't, we're there for nefarious reasons of pleasure and self-promotion or egotistical kind of desire to do something that we see as valid and good. But there are people earning their livings and endangering their lives from our simplistic pleasures. And so it's it's part of the game. I think no Sherpa is forced into it. But like as a cook,
are those lows, are they balanced out by the highs of maybe standing on the summit or looking back up at the summit and saying, I achieved that?
What's the saying? It's better to have, what is it? When you've broken, better to have loved and failed than to have never loved.
Lost and never loved at all, yeah.
Right. So I think, yes, I wouldn't have known Tindu had I not met him through climbing mountains, and we shared amazing experiences. He was there when the lady became very unwell at Camp 2 that we discussed a few minutes ago, and as a result, her husband, who was a watchmaker in Pittsburgh, he basically paid for him and his friend Namgil to go out and become watchmakers. So their lives completely changed as it happened. Yeah. It was kind of up and down period of their lives, but it's he had a great opportunity as a result of climbing, and he knew the risks, but I guess you never expect to die. It's a possibility, but you never expect to lose your life.
Yeah.
Those kind of. So are they outweighed by the ups? Yeah. My life is complete. If I get killed tomorrow, I'll be it's a tragedy in terms of not being able to see my daughter grow up, or. There are so many other things, other projects I'd like to get involved with or do. But I feel like I've lived my life. I've never to the full, because
rather than just existed.
Yeah, I see so many people who just live. They're not living their life. They're just walking through it, and it's sometimes through no fault of their own. I think love and nurturing at the beginning of your life, that's really important. So my parents always gave me love and nurturing for sure. They tried to give me the opportunity. You need to have that moment in time where you take control and make the opportunities. You can't just be passive. I know summiting Everest, second summit in 2010, that was bringing up my 7th summit, and the first time a Brit or anyone, actually a Westerner, had done 2 double summits. A double summit in the same climbing season. That was a week apart. The first one was 8 days apart. It was like, wow, that's, I'd be like going into a bar and I'd be chatting to some of the most famous climbers in the world, and they wouldn't be telling me to piss off, they'd be like, and like, so I had a bit of respect from, the medical tragedies or difficulties on the mountain. I was often the guy called to go up and, administer aid on the mountain, so it was like, there were some great moments on that mountain. And 2007, the second summit, before I blew up my trachea from my airway, I'd realized I wasn't feeling so good. I knew something was impending, like sixth sense, but I was still able to proceed and move cleanly and with, faster than the guys coming behind me. So I was about 100 meters in front. The Sherpas were one-to-one with the members. So I was kind of surveying, and I got to the summit and I was there all by myself for 10, 15 minutes. I mean, an incredible moment in time just to sit there on the summit of the world, this place that becomes so important for me, that defined me up until that point and still does in many ways. The reason I'm talking to you is because of Everest, not my failed Atlantic Road, So it's an amazing place, amazing people. Expeditioning is awesome. It's like you're living your life. You're going for something positive as opposed to trying to correct something that's negative. So my job as a doctor is about trying to get someone back to their baseline, and their baseline often isn't very good. Whereas in the mountains, I'm trying to take someone to the very top of their achievement list, to push them beyond their wildest dreams. It's the mirror image of being a doctor.
So before I started interviewing Rob, I didn't actually know about his Atlantic rowing attempt. But this is a story that you're not going to want to miss.
We were delayed by a month for the departure because of unseasonal weather on the east coast of America, hurricanes on the east coast, which you'll know much more about this in terms of weather systems. But the Azores, there's normally a high pressure system that develops end of the year, beginning of January, February time. So that develops the trade wind from the west coast of Africa. So easterlies from the west coast of Africa will push most boat-faring vessels towards the east coast of America or the Caribbean. So to row, actually, you could just sit on your boat and you probably make direct direction progress. But we had really unseasonal weather, which basically affected our departure date. We couldn't leave because it was very just unusually bad weather where we were, but also no Azores high pressure. So nothing was working in the right favor for us. And then, so we left a month later than we should have done, in kind of the 10th of January. It should have been the beginning of December. So we'd planned 60 days would be a reasonably good time.
Yeah.
But that's with a lot of help from the trade winds. So we didn't have any help from the trade winds, and we left at the beginning to mid-January. And we got to the 73rd day, and I was due on Everest about 10 days later. I was supposed to be trekking in with my mother-in-law to take it. And then I actually was guiding people on Everest, and I don't know. I was like, I'm not sure I can just pull out on my mother-in-law. I felt a real sense of responsibility, and a friend. I just thought, I can't. What can I do? I don't know. I can't just pitch up hard midway through the expedition either on an Everest.
Yeah.
I was not being paid, but I had my trip paid for on Everest by people who'd worked hard and sacrificed a lot to go on an Everest expedition with me. So I couldn't just toss that over the side of the boat. And of course, I was like, I'm so close. I'm like 280 miles from Antigua. And of course, we're doing up and down. So we're rowing longer or further than the actual distance as the crow flies. Plus, we had 5 or 6 days of stormy weather. So we were on sea anchor, which is like a huge parachute you dump in the ocean. You hope the currents will do better than the wind pushing against you. The current should be taking you towards where you're going. So the anchor kind of catches that, you're being pulled in the right direction, but the wind's obviously trying to blow you back. So, we lost 50 miles in a day on many numbers of days, in this storm. It's very, very depressing.
That's like Sisyphean, pushing the rock up the hill just for it to roll back down again.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But the things didn't go that well. I should say it's nothing to hide. And I think there are often, conflicts of interest or conflicts of personality in the office. I'm sure there are in the cockpit. You haven't always flown with the people you'd necessarily get on most with. And I think for a really stressful situation, the person that I chose to be with was probably not the right match. And he wasn't in the right frame of mind before departure. My life was going from kind of strength to strength. I had now my wife, but a girlfriend who I was very close with, and I was going to propose to her soon after I, got back from Everest in 2010. I think we were already engaged to be married. So life was pretty clear for me and going really well. And for him, he had a breakup just before leaving. We because we had this extra month, he went back to try and salvage his relationship. It broke down again. He lost 14, 15 pounds in a month by kind of just neglecting himself, I think. So I was like, geez, who are you? That's all right. I won't say who it is because it's not.
Okay.
I don't want to kind of. But yeah, so when you have to check the water maker, we didn't know what, you don't know what you have to do before you do it. You kind of have you get an idea, you do some training, you do an ocean master's course, so you have an idea about navigation, how to read the stars with the sextant, or the position of the sun with the sextant, but you never use that. You're using a GPS. But we had a water maker, the machine which is sucking in the water to transfer across to the filtration area. The actual motor was bathing itself in water, a leaking cabinet that was filling with water every day. So we had to manually evacuate that. Otherwise, we were always going to be at risk of our water maker breaking down. And we had a checklist that every time you change shift, 2 hours on, 2 hours off, you go and check the water maker, or at least 3 or 4 times a day. But he wasn't he'll say was. So it's probably he said, she said, that kind of. I don't want to get into school grounds politics. But I was quite clear in my mind what I was expected to do. But it was very difficult to have a conversation. It was very difficult to talk to that person. And when you were trying to bring the concerns that you had about, husbandry of the boat and how it was suffering and how that could actually really affect our capacity to cross the ocean. It led to conflict. And so it was really, really, I had some very dark moments actually on the row. It was kind of, I had some amazing moments on the row. I remember nights where I was pretty sleepy. It was almost hallucinating, but like putting in the paddle and just seeing ever increasing circles of phosphorescence from the paddle. And as you lift up the paddle, it drops down and you see this amazing phosphorescence. I mean, incredible. And then big mammals, whales, dolphins, following the boat, swimming with us, for days or hours, and big storms, and you're out rowing and you've got a leash on your ankle, and there are stories where people have rowed, they've gone to bed and they come out and the other person's not on deck. There's one person who won't listen, So you realize a leash on your ankle that's the difference between life or death, or it could be.
Yeah.
And you do get rogue waves sometimes. It's really incredible. I mean, it's an incredible experience. And like when you push off from La Gomera, where we left from, that's where the race that I was participating in. It's an incredible sense of adventure. I was doing something different to climbing, but to see terra firma drift off by, and we were in not the nicest of conditions. It was like, bloody hell, this is way beyond anything I could have imagined. This is another level of complexity. We're going to be days or weeks from help. That's not nothing. That's something. And so it was And as I realized we were having a bit of a difficult time together, it was like, oh, this is going to be tough. But and then
you had your mother-in-law to worry about, of course. So.
Well, so on the 73rd day, I mean, I'm not someone who gives up. I'll never give up. Once I'm in it, once there's a lot riding on it, we'd spent months of our lives working double shifts to pay for this boat, which is like sucking money out of our lives. It was probably all told, maybe 25 grand each.
Yeah, wow.
I'm not, I'm from a very modest background. That's money I'd earned. A lot of people were doing sponsorship, and either they were doing professional sponsorship or they were just had wealthy contacts, but we put that boat through love, blood, sweat and tears. And to see it all go up in flames at the end was pretty tragic, but he finished, thankfully. So I think at least he got something from it, even though, it was tricky for him.
So did you get taken off the boat?
Yes, there's two support vessels, and one came out when they knew that I had this kind of ambitious project of rowing the ocean followed by climbing Everest. Uh-huh. I never imagined. I thought I'd have like a couple of weeks holiday on Antigua. My wife, and it'd be awesome. And instead, I got literally the dump in the ocean. When I got picked up, they literally they're going at 2 knots. That's the slowest they can go. We're going we're pretty much idling 0. It's amazing how fast 2 knots an hour is when a large sailing vessel comes by you. But like literally, I had all my personal belongings in bin bags tied in a row. I had they threw this I think a really long line that I had to attach to myself in the time that it took for the vessel to come close by. And then suddenly I'm whipped off the boat. I'm literally flying through the air. Then I'm suddenly being dragged in the water. And like I'm pulled in eventually with my gear. It's amazing how it all worked out. But like, you're in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Yeah. There's no light. There's no ambient lighting. Nothing. You don't have any personal locator beacon. Just like there's so many things that could have. When I think about it, like, and it's such a minor thing to jump in the water from a boat. I mean, it's not a big deal.
But it isn't. It is when it's bottomless.
Well, yeah, exactly. And so, or a big fish could eat you. But who knows? Anyway, in 2 days I was in Antigua. I had one night in Antigua. I flew back to the UK. 2 days later, I was on a flight to Nepal, and I was literally less than a week. I was walking to base camp, and I still had like jelly legs. I could barely walk.
This imagery of a sort of bearded Robinson Crusoe being yanked off his little rowing boat.
I mean, this story is just crazy. I thought we were here to talk about Everest, and there's this whole other...
Yeah.
It can almost...
It could be a whole podcast on its own, yeah.
But I tell you what's really interesting is how important, particularly if you think back to our interview with Kat and Raz,
yeah,
and how we we kind of really identified the importance of that unfaltering trust in each other and being part of a really strong team, and you can see the sort of wheels coming off.
Yeah, you don't imagine many scenarios where one of you being yanked off the rowing boat by another boat would probably leave you both feeling a bit relieved.
I mean, it's bizarre, isn't it? And how tense that must have been with two people in such an intense situation. Well, similar to Nick and Hamish on their role.
Yeah.
But to both be in such different headspaces. You know, Rob speaks a lot about the importance of your psychological state. Yeah. And, you know, this one really, really hits home.
It must have been a tough conversation, like, oh, I'm sorry, mate, I've got another appointment.
Good luck.
Rob and I briefly discussed how it must have been difficult going from rowing the Atlantic to climbing a mountain, given that he probably lost an awful lot of weight. And this reminded Rob of a moment during his childhood that he thinks was the making of him.
I was a really obese child, and I think that's probably one of the things that changed me, actually. I was, when I went from primary school to secondary school, you know Grange Hill, you'll probably remember.
Yeah.
And Rowley was the fat kid, and I just didn't want to have to be. My friends were so great to me. My friends always loved me for who I was, not for what I looked like. But anyway, I decided to do it for myself. So I lost. We did a 24-hour famine to raise money for Ethiopia. It was like that era, you know, like the 80s, mid 80s. I was in 86. So I didn't eat for 24 hours. And I remember the cheese and onion flan and baked potato and tomato, baked beans that I would love normally and roofed down like a voracious, animal normally. I was like, when your stomach shrivels up after 24 hours, it's a bit less able to eat. And I suddenly realized this needs to change now. And so I lost,
So how old were you?
I was 11, but I decided to go on started counting calories at 11. It became almost, I have to say, probably a bit, I can see how anorexia can some vulnerable people. But yeah, I lost 50 pounds, which is, like 3 stone in weight, over 3 stone in weight. I went down I had custom made shorts for school by my aunt because Marks and Spencer or BHS didn't have the biggest short size wouldn't fit me. So I had to have a 30, short uniform for school.
Yeah. But you didn't do this because you were bullied or anything like that. You did this because you said, I want to do this for me. That's amazing. So you've obviously a very strong-minded person.
I think that's what triggered it. I think I realized that if I didn't want to be Rowley in Grange Hill, and it probably wouldn't have been that. Well, I think I would have been actually, but I'm glad I did it.
Can we say that Rowley from Grange Hill is your influence, your biggest influence in life?
Absolutely.
I'd want to run with that.
You can because but I would say that people who carry more weight than they perhaps should can be extremely fit and healthy, and they can be very happy. And I think being thin and aesthetically, nice looking is not the way to success. So I would stress that it's not. But it was. I think there was a whole. How an 11-year-old. I don't really know why they do a lot of things that they do, but like I realized, I just didn't want that to be the case. But anyway, when I lost the weight, suddenly like the school disco, the girl, you could dance with a girl. I could throw a ball further than I could when I was fatter. I was a goalkeeper in football before changing to rugby, but I suddenly became really good at football. I was more agile. Everything became much better. And I realized I was kind of physically much more able than I had been, and as it turns out, quite competitive in a number of different areas, just because of harnessing what I had as opposed to neglecting what I had.
So people often will come up with reasons why they can't do X, Y, or Z, be it climbing Everest, row the Atlantic, start a business. What advice would you give to people then?
Neuro-linguistic programming is a really good way of doing it if you want to look at it scientifically. And if you're trying to say to someone you should stop smoking, or any habit that someone does, or any reason why you're not doing something, you shouldn't. You don't engender success by saying you shouldn't do that or you should do this, a kind of command. It's like, what do you have to gain by continuing what you're doing? And what do you have to gain from making the change that we're suggesting or that you need to propose to yourself? So like smoking is a great example. What do you have to gain by continuing? Okay, so it's not all, Gitan on the Champs-Elysees with a beautiful French woman. It's actually you're smoking a cigarette just because it's a habit. You like the taste, maybe. Social. Who knows? I don't know the reasons why people smoke. But what do you gain by not smoking? It's like, well, you're going to gain more money in your pocket. You can go on a holiday that you couldn't have had, or you can buy that bike that you. I have a lot of patients who say to me, "Oh, you're a rich doctor. You've got a nice bike." I said, "Well, with the $3,000 that I spent on my bike, that's how much you spent on cigarettes last year." So I just made my choice. It's like you've got that choice, and of course, that's from a doctor's perspective. That's too simplistic. It'll never work for most people just by telling them no, it doesn't. But so for someone who's saying I can't, someone who's thinking about doing something that they're worried they will fail at, or worried that it's beyond their capacity to do, I guess that's the same thing, isn't it? But or financially beyond what they can do. Financial things is a tough one, isn't it? It's there's no justice in that, but there's always we can come around to that in a second. But it's like, what do you gain by not trying? And what do you gain by actually pushing yourself forwards? And what do you risk by not trying? What do you risk by trying? And I think it comes down to that better to have loved and lost.
I saw the James Bond movie last night, and they had a line in it which was something like man was born to live, not just to exist, or something like that. It comes out at the end, and it's obviously a famous quote. I need to dig it out, but I think that's kind of summed up, the stuff that you've told me today, which is kind of this idea of just sort of breaststroking through a sea of lethargy in your life, rather than making things happen and going out and doing it, whether you fail or whether you pull it off.
Yeah, and I think, of course, it's a bit different for an Olympic athlete. We become an Olympic athlete just to come 10th. You go into it dreaming of a gold medal, and so that becomes more and more realistic over time, and you know whether you have a chance. And I guess if you know you're not going to win a gold medal when you go to the Olympics, you change your objectives. It's a bit like people walking to base camp or going there to climb the mountain thereafter. Base camp of Everest. When I go there trekking, I'm like, bloody hell, that mountain is so high. I could never climb that mountain. If you're walking there to then climb the mountain, it's like, it's really high, but like I've already gone halfway up by the time I get to base camp, and you break it down into little bits, and suddenly the challenge at each level is much less than the challenge as a whole. So there are lots of techniques for making something more palatable, more tangible. Because I do think, things seem impossible to do, but until you try, you'll never know. So I think unless you're completely adverse to failing, then I think you're missing out a lot by never trying. So
I like that.
I think it's a real false illusion to believe that you have to succeed at everything. And some of my best friends at medical school who burned themselves out were always driven to always achieve and to do the best they possibly could. And sometimes you just have to take a step back and say, it's okay if it doesn't work out. It's just take a step back. And I'm not lusting for failure, by the way, don't get me wrong.
No, but accepting that it's an outcome of trying something is important, isn't it? Otherwise you might not try.
So what do you think?
I really enjoyed that. It's a roller coaster.
Yeah.
I feel like that I've been on a journey with Rob. But in terms of the toolbox?
Well, yeah. So I mean, there's the big thing that sticks out of me throughout the whole discussion with Rob is that he is a fine example of someone with a growth mindset. And so actually, I just brought up on Google 10 key characteristics of growth mindset. And we've got number 1, resilience from failure.
Yeah, he has just spoken to us about that.
Yeah, develop confidence from the effort. Is that the post-adrenaline junkie?
Yeah, we spoke about that earlier. Well, also how he said when he came back from his first summit, going back to being a junior doctor, he was so full of confidence, having had achieved something.
Yeah, work well with others, a strength of teamwork and collaboration.
I think that's a no-brainer.
Yeah, confidence is not arrogance. Keep humbly improving yourself.
I've written down so many times through listening to this how humble, how modest he is.
Yeah, he's also obviously confident as well. Determined attitude towards goals, which is we've said about. Make it happen for yourself is like a line for Rob, isn't it?
And also because you were right to pick up on that, because he does talk about that at the beginning of the interview, and it's only until quite a bit later you realise that was a mindset he adopted at 11 years old. And that was almost the inciting incident of his life in terms of realising that you've got to take your own opportunity.
Yeah. And I think a lot of us do things that are hard because of external influences. I imagine that for a lot of people, they'll say, oh, well, certainly kids, people tease me about this, so I'm going to do X about it. But for Robbie, he said, no, I just decided I want to do this for me. And then the last one on this list here, it actually said 10 characteristics, and I've only done 7, but we got focus on process instead of product, which throughout this whole series has come up, which is this fear of failure. Whereas if you focus on the process, the journey, basically, enjoy the journey, and, the end might happen. And perhaps that's key to Mountaineers, because you can't always make the summit and it's not your fault.
And he does say that he thinks it's a false illusion to believe that you have to succeed at everything. And if you go into particularly something like Everest, which is such an endurance event in terms of the acclimatization, the amount of time you've got to give to it, accepting that it could be 6 weeks, could be 8 weeks, could be 3 months, weather, external factors, injury, tracheitis, there's all these different factors that you have to accept as part of the journey that you're speaking about. It's it's the whole package, not just the set the goal, achieve the goal. And
anything but achieving the goal means that you've wasted your time. Exactly. Because he talks about his ocean row. I'd love to row an ocean. It just sounds amazing. And he didn't finish it, but that doesn't take away the moments sat there with whales or the bioluminescence in the sea. You still experience all of those bits.
Our guest this week was Dr. Rob Casserley. He's co-founder of a trekking company called Trek 8848. Thank you for listening to Extraordinariness. It was co-produced by myself, Jonathan Harmon, and Joanne Spence. Music was by Coma Media. If you enjoyed the show, please do tell someone about it. Also, maybe like it, give us a rating, or if you have time, leave us a comment. And as promised, if you want to stick around for that digression onto high altitude supplementary oxygen, here it is.
To a certain altitude, you may go to Camp 1 and then Camp 2 in one trip and come back down. So that's from 5,400 meters at base camp to 6,000 at Camp 1, 6,400 at Camp 2. Spend a couple of days and nights there. You come back down. You have 3 or 4 days of regenerating, eating, shitting, sleeping. That's pretty much the recipe for success. But excuse my French. Too much time.
And the purpose of this is for your body to basically more red blood cells, make it so that you can hold more oxygen. This is the purpose of the acclimatization and going up and down.
Exactly. And so you can't do it alpine style Everest. And if most people use supplemental oxygen, the flow rates and the delivery of oxygen that you get is actually fairly minimal. So if you look at a 2 liter flow rate of oxygen, so from a medical perspective, I'm really intrigued and interested in the physiology of high altitude adaptation or acclimatization. But if you're breathing, say, at rest, 300 milliliters with every breath, and you're breathing in maybe 14 times, you can work out that that's about 4.2 liters of air transfer every minute. So if I was just at rest with a 2 liter flow rate of oxygen, 2 liters per minute, I could actually have half of my inspiratory air as oxygen because I'm getting 2 liters of oxygen, I'm breathing in 4.2 liters. But if you listen to some of the video I have from high up on Everest, I'm breathing 60 breaths a minute. My tidal volumes are maybe 5 to 750 milliliters, probably a lot more. Tidal volume is the amount of air you're drawing in. But as you know, if you take in a massive breath of air, you're probably drawing in a couple of liters for most people. Yeah. So in one breath of air, I've taken in a volume of 2 liters. So if you're getting 2 liters of oxygen in a minute, and I'm breathing 60 breaths a minute and up to 2 liters a time, the actual concentration of oxygen, the difference is very, very minimal. But it does make a difference, a performance difference. It's not It's an insignificant, significant difference, if you see what I mean.
Right. And okay, yeah. So
you could go up on oxygen. People think, can I just not strap on oxygen right from the bottom and go to the top, like in a few days, knock it out, up and down? And the answer is no, you can't.
And I mean,
adapt.
Like, I don't want to spend too long veering off on a really geeky chat about supplementary oxygen, but it's really interesting because from a flying perspective, we talk about it's the partial pressure of the oxygen that's the problem rather than the quantity. Is that if the pressure's not high enough, it literally can't be pushed through your,
So now you get into a really even more interesting concept of physiology, but very as briefly as I can and simply as I can, not for you, but for anyone. Things move from one place to another because of a pressure gradient or a concentration gradient. So if you have oxygen, which is in the air, will diffuse naturally into our blood via a kind of active process of breathing in and then diffusion across a membrane in the lung wall, because it's moving from a higher concentration of oxygen to a lower concentration of oxygen in your blood. But that gradient becomes much, 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 much more shallow the higher you go, as there's a lower partial pressure of oxygen. And around the summit of Everest, that kind of gradient is zero.
Right.
So depending on the day, if we have a high pressure day on Everest, there is more chance of someone trying to go without oxygen will summit.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Because if you think about it, it's the partial pressure, it's the availability of oxygen molecules. So it's literally, as you will know very well, it's the compression of the same number of molecules into a smaller space. Therefore, or if partial pressure is increased, so you'll be getting more molecules for every air intake. But that generates the oxygen pressure within your arteries, and then to your tissues, and it's all down a chain of oxygen gradient. And what we're looking at more and more in terms of research is what happens at the mitochondria. So if you can actually get oxygen to the mitochondria, how does that, can you still function at a very, very, very low partial pressure of oxygen with no oxygen gradient between the atmosphere and your mitochondria? But that's to cut it in a nutshell. Someone asked me, why do we need oxygen? And it's all to do with ATP, this energy block that our bodies use. It's not the glucose actually, but it's how glucose interacts with oxygen and water and is fed into the metabolic powerhouse of our cells, the mitochondria. And if you don't have any oxygen, you make about 4 ATP for every Krebs cycle. And if you have oxygen, I think you make 38, or someone's going to check this up and find that I'm way out, but I think it's about 36 or 38 ATP molecules. So it's much more efficient with oxygen. If you don't have oxygen, you just grind to a halt. Metabolically, you become status vegetalis. I don't know.
Right. Okay. Let's move on from that.